that this is for education and information purposes only. We're not CPAs or attorneys or uh, um, what else? Financial planners, right? Doctors, Indian chiefs, whatever the list may be. But we do want to be able to share with our viewers and guests that um, what we teach is for the purposes of having good information to go on to be, you know, note investors. And so the topic today, and I know we talked a little bit about it last week, was I want to talk about due diligence. I think that
Cool.
due diligence is taken for granted a little bit, especially if you're doing notes. I think that, now things for us, we take for granted and we don't talk about it enough. And um, I think there's more to due diligence than just doing due diligence, that its role as far as a note investor is concerned. And, the comfort and security that it gives to our investors who invest with us. So I know you have a lot on this topic. So well, I don't know where you would like to begin, but I'm going to give the floor to you first before I get started. But
Uh,
let's walk through due diligence.
All right, sounds great. Um, I think the first thing that to say is we're going to do what we call some of the key items for doing due diligence,
Yeah,
and some of the key takeaways. Um, and I may focus more on non-performing notes, but in reality, much of the due diligence we're going to talk about is for any note that you buy. And
right,
you want to
right,
make sure that you have a good investment, that you're going to get a good return on your investment, and so on. So you really need to know how to look at a note and how to make a decision about what you want to do with that note.
right.
So to get started, I know Kim, one of the things you say is that due diligence is the basis of our strategy.
I knew
You want
you'd
to say
get
a
ready to
little
say
bit more about
that.
that?
So I knew you'd get ready to say
Yeah.
that. I do think of it as a strategy. I think a lot falls out in due diligence, and like you said, we'll touch on some key points, and and a lot of it will be driven by the fact that our expertise is in non-performing notes, and um, that when doing the due diligence, it starts to shape the investment, right? It starts to shape the strategy of investing with especially non-performing notes. And we also do seconds as well. So with performing notes, there's a lot that you could take for granted for, and like you said, you probably should do a lot of what we do anyway with performing notes. But it's particularly important to do a thorough due diligence when you're doing non-performing notes. And no two notes are the same. No two borrowers are the same.
True.
The
That's,
investments are different.
yeah.
Um, and the due diligence begins to shape how you're going to invest in a
Yeah.
particular note, especially for a non-performing note. So yeah, that's why I said it. And I look forward to the due diligence. To me, it's like a puzzle, and I'm putting it together. And I'm constantly thinking and processing while we're going through the due diligence. So yeah, it is part of my strategy for sure.
Cool. Cool. Um, and one of the things that, when we're starting to look at notes that we kind of think about is we put together what we call our buy box.
Hmm.
The buy box, the basis of the buy box is really looking at our risk tolerance, and what factors go into that. We look at where we're comfortable. Kim was
Hmm.
talking about some of the non-performing notes that we purchased or the seconds. We also do performing notes. We do first lien position too, and so we're looking at what is our comfort zone with each of those classes of notes.
Right.
And then finally, what is our expectation? What do we want to get out of this note? And during the due diligence process, that's when we start to walk through that. With the
Hmm.
performing note, what do you want to get out? You want to get paid every month. That's pretty much it. With a non-performing note, there's some other nuances and other things that you may want as a result of investing in a particular note.
Right. Right.
Um, the other thing I'll say as we get started here is that what we're going to talk about is just a couple or three topics today. It's not an
Okay.
exhaustive list. The list is pretty long. And if we get some pretty good feedback from this session, we may do part two and part three of due diligence to go into some of those other aspects of due diligence that we're not going to cover today.
Okay.
And finally, we could do a whole weekend seminar on due diligence. And you'll see in the course of what we're saying that it's kind of the fun part for us is going through and doing
Yeah.
the due diligence, solving the puzzle to determine, is this a note that you can make money on?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
having said all of that, as Kim said, it's the basis of our strategy. It determines what we invest. It determines how much we invest. It determines what kind of returns we're looking at to get and when we're getting those returns.
Right.
Um, as we're scrubbing a note and looking at all of the details behind that note, if it's a performing note, obviously we're expecting to get a fixed return over some period of time, starting pretty much immediately.
Right.
With the non-performing note, the we expect that there's a return target that we have, and typically we hit that target. And then the only issue is how long is it going to take in order to be able to get that return. The final thing I'll say before we hop into is this is more art. This is the art of managing the science.
Yeah. That's a good
What
way
I
of putting
mean
it.
by that is that yeah, there are a lot of numbers. There's a lot of data, but the art is how do you look at that data in a way to make a decision on what do you want to do. It's
Right.
not black and white. It's really playing in the gray, and it's like we're in the gray. Sometimes one item will be more important than another, and we just kind of work through that. And because there's a team of us that are looking at it, when we're looking at building our portfolio, we tend to come to a better answer by doing that.
Yeah. And with the all the set of eyes that are on it, right? Depending on what we're looking at, um, we see different things, right?
Mhm.
It's amazing how the same note, same data, um, but something might trigger something to one person at the table versus the other, right? And we share that information, which makes it a thorough investigation into is this a good note to invest in?
True,
So
true. So to get started, there are kind of three things that are important to us initially when we're looking at notes. The first is the borrower and being able to understand who the borrower
mhm,
is, and all of the background stuff on them. And we'll talk about that in detail. The other is location. Where is the property located? And finally, is there equity? We never buy a note where there's no equity, where the owner of the note has very little equity in the property. Because the idea is if you don't have any equity, there's a higher probability that you may decide to walk away from this thing or something like that. So we're looking at equity as another piece of it. So to get started, we look at the borrower. One of the first things that we look at with the borrower is their credit report. We'll pull those, and we want to know details. But you kind of want to know high level, you know, touchy feely kind of details, I guess, for lack of anything better. We want to know payment history.
mhm,
And payment history, it's, you know, what does it look like? Not just for the note that we buy, but for all of your
expenses,
other
yeah,
debt.
mhm,
Yeah. Because we try to get a picture of, are you somebody that pays your bills?
mhm,
If you pay your bills, if you pay all of your bills, you're going to pay our note. And we're pretty sure of that. So we look at, are you making your car payment? Are you making your home payment? What kind of job do you have? Those are the things that are kind of going into the mix. No one thing is going to be bigger than the other, but that's all part of the stew, the soup that we're looking at as we go through this.
yeah,
Um, Another thing that we look at is how much debt are you carrying? Do you feel like you're overly extended? Or do we feel like you're overly extended? And the other piece is what kind of debt? If you got a lot of credit card debt, or do you have medical debt? my personal feeling, I kind of ignored the medical debt because it really, that's a life happens type of thing. So we'll get into, but if there's a lot of credit card debt, then I kind of worry, will you be able to have enough money to pay us back? Um, One of the things that I'll kind of let Kim lead on this one, we look for repetitive credit abuse.
Mm.
And, the reason I let Kim talk about it is that I may say some things I don't want to have recorded.
Well, it's true that the credit report, I know a lot of people go off credit scores and things of that nature, but um, the credit report actually can tell you a lot about the borrower and who they are as far as character is concerned. Um, Bankruptcy shows up on your credit report. Um, the other thing is that you may decide I pay these set of bills this month, and then I pay these set of bills the next month, right? And that still says a little bit about the borrower that they're still interested in paying their bills, but they're managing the resources that they have, right? And so that's not always a bad thing. That just says they're stretched, right? So we begin to understand that about the borrower, right? The other
Yeah.
thing that we look at is especially if we're looking at a second and non-performing, is that if the first lien is current, that's important because that says to us that they care about their house. They care about living there. They're emotionally attached to it. Nothing else gets paid. The house gets paid, right? Which is great because now we're looking at, in the event that we have to push the envelope in regards to making sure that the debt that they're carrying on the second is paid, that they're going to do that because they don't want to give up their house, and that's demonstrated through their report. Um, and not only that, we also, and I know you're going to touch it, I'm not going to give too much information, but the equity that's involved in the house, right, with the lien.
Yeah.
So this begins to tell a story about the borrower, right, and what's important to them, and if they are a serial bankruptcy, they abuse the system or not. You begin to see that in their report, right? What do they
Yeah.
abuse? And all of that tells a story, and when you have to look at it a little closely to understand and what's important to them and how much their job is important to them, et cetera,
Mhm.
et cetera. So
Yeah.
it's fun to look at the credit reports because you begin to know a little bit about the borrower and how serious they're going to take things when you get in touch with them.
Yeah. So um, that's kind of how we build a picture of the borrower. The next thing is we look at where is the property located.
Mm,
And that's really important to us as well.
right.
One of the big pieces of that is understanding the metro data. And we pull down a humongous amount of metro data on, by zip code for where the property is located. We want to understand the vacancy rates. We want to know household incomes. We want to know median house or home prices. Um, we look at vacancy rates and days on market, all those kinds of things. The idea is that if something were to go wrong, is this an area that people are interested in living in? Is it a
We have
declining
a
area?
measure by Walmart, right? We decide if
Yeah,
something's
yeah,
rural, okay,
yeah,
where if something's rural, where's Walmart? How
yeah,
close is
yeah.
Walmart?
That the rural metric is literally where is the Walmart. If there's no Walmart, we got to think about that one. But so location, is it an area that's growing or declining or flat? Is it an area that seems to be desirable? Are houses moving rapidly in that area? You
Mm,
know, Not that I'm trying to do something to take the house or anything like that. It's more for understanding how does a borrower think about this particular property. If they're in an area that's declining, is their job going to be there and are they going to be able to pay? Or is their job moving to some other part of the country? So those are things that we're looking at. We
mhm.
also look at local employers. you'd be surprised. Kim was just joking about, the rural and the Walmart metric, but we also look for who are the other employers in town.
Right. Right.
We buy a lot of notes in college towns, quite frankly.
Right.
And why is that? Because the largest employer in the town or in the area is the local college. And it may be of size, and, that changes the dynamics of that particular community. So
Right.
we look at that, we look at local employers. Um, and then, I mentioned declining home values and things like that. We also look at population change.
Right. The
So
growth.
is the area growing
Mhm.
or is it shrinking?
Right.
Or is it just flat? There's some, if you think about it, there's certain parts of the country right now that are booming. Texas, Florida, the Carolinas, Arizona. They're growing very rapidly, which means housing prices are going up. Other places, in some parts of the quote unquote Rust Belt, housing prices are not rising as fast. They're going up, but they're not rising as fast, or they may be just flat. So
Mhm.
that's something else that we're going to be taking into account as we're looking at a particular node. The final thing, and I mentioned it earlier, and Kim kind of alluded to it as well, is we look at the equity, and how long has the borrower been in the house is a real important thing for us. We want to make sure that they are emotionally attached to this house.
Right.
Um, and Kim will joke when she says, I like pretty houses. I think that if you're living in a pretty house, you're going to do everything you can to keep that house, which means you're probably going to pay your mortgage.
Right. No, there is some value to that in regard to, you know, having a being partial or biased to pretty houses because, um, again, it it is a indicative characteristic of the borrower, how they feel, their home pride, if you will. Um, but it also helps us in regards to, worst case scenario, exit strategy for the note in the event that we should for some reason end up with the property, you know, what can we do with the property? We don't really face that kind of situation, but we function out of that mindset, right? Because no sooner than we drop that measure or metric to evaluate whether or not this is a good note, we'll be faced with an exit strategy that we probably didn't take into consideration. So, it's much easier with the pretty houses. And so that becomes part of the evaluation in our due diligence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as we're talking about that, going back to our risk tolerance. Our
Mm-hmm.
risk tolerance says we want to make sure that we get capital and we get the return of our capital, that our investors get their return on their capital first and foremost. So our risk tolerance is relatively low.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's part of what we're thinking about when we're looking at this. Again, going back to equity, we want to make sure that the borrower has some skin in the game and that there's equity to cover any expenses that we may encounter when we buy this note. We want to make sure that there's equity there to cover legal costs, um, that's there to
Taxes.
cover, we've got property taxes, um, HOA fees, and
Mm,
any other liens that are on the property. You want to make
right.
sure, or we want to make sure that those are all covered and that that's part of what we're looking at when we're looking at buying a property.
And we look at those things. I know you didn't mention that being a key factor, but we do look at to see what liens are on on the property, right?
Mhm.
When we're doing the due diligence, we already have a good idea of what is exposed on the property during the due diligence. It's a very extensive list of items to go through in regards to evaluating the property and understanding the exposures or the liens or the debts that are not part of the um, investment initially, we already know what that is when we make the investment.
True, true. Final thing on equity, we look at loan to value.
Mm,
Specifically, if we're looking at a second lien, we're looking at combined loan to value. So we're taking into account the second lien as well as the first lien and looking at the value of the property. We will never buy anything where you don't have a loan to value or an equity position that is at least 20%. And typically we're looking for about 25%. So you want to make sure that you're in a very strong, solid position there. Again, because you want to make sure you have equity to cover any unexpected expenses. Because the idea is we're trying to make money, we're going to make money off of this particular note. So,
yeah. And then you don't want to get underwater because, especially in the event that it's a second lien position, right? The first lien is going to be satisfied no matter what. So,
yep.
and all that is attached to the first lien, right? So
Yeah.
you have to take all of that into consideration. Um, again, these are the key, I guess, top three that we look at, but there's an exhaustive list of due diligence items that we take into consideration. And I almost want to say that, when we're investing or we're investing for others, right, for other investors, there's a
Mhm.
part one due diligence process, if you will, and then there's a part two due diligence process, right? Um, we look at, first of all, this is, well, a lot of what we discussed was before, right? We decide whether or not this is something that we want to invest in, right? Whether or not this is a good note. But upon the investment, right? When we finally take hold or attain the note, we then go through another process, another due diligence process, and that brings in a whole nother set of evaluation factors that either support what you've already have looked into or expose things that maybe that were not readily available to you as far as information is concerned. Um, one thing about Jerry is Excel wizard, and you can't talk to him unless you have an Excel sheet, and he only understands the numbers on the Excel sheet, and you got to be able to prove it to him via Excel, and the data, and the whole thing takes on a automated kind of approach, and spits out numbers, and evaluation, et cetera, et cetera. But still, once those title reports are ran and we get a property report on the property, um, they still have to support the numbers and or the picture or the house or the equity. And we've been surprised a couple of times. So that's another thing about due diligence. It's not something that you do one time or in a minute or you know take things into take things for granted. It requires a thorough investigation and evaluation and due process of doing the due diligence from the beginning to end to really determine whether or not this is a note that the investment is worthy of.
True.
Did I
Very
miss
true.
anything? The
Nope.
surprises have been interesting at best, because just when you thought you had a goodie and reports come back and you're like, oh my goodness, this is not this is not what we thought it was. And
Yep.
because you have that due diligence window, thank goodness, you can make some changes. And so
Absolutely.
we've had to do that a couple of times. But that only came with the fact that we were persistent in our due diligence. And so I think that's the message I want to get across today is that, due diligence, due diligence, due diligence. Don't overlook it, don't overstep it, don't take it for granted, implement it. And, it becomes part of who you are as a note investor. It does for me anyway. So,
Yeah. All right.
anything more you
Well,
want to give on
I
that?
think I think we've covered what we wanted to talk about in this section or this segment. Just the
Hmm.
three topics. And as Kim said, the list is pretty exhaustive. It's pretty long. But this is how we start looking at a note. These are the first things that kind of jump out of us. This is kind of our surface level due diligence. Um, and, as Kim said, once we've gotten a bit in on a note, we'll dive deeper and really look at more parameters, more factors before we finally say, yes, we want this note in our portfolio.
Yeah, yeah. And our process has not failed us, right? It's
No,
part of the risk mitigation, right?
yeah,
And
we've
you
been
know,
um, we've been very, very fortunate, and because we're doing this in a very thorough, systematic manner, we've not had any issues with notes that we've purchased.
yeah, the process has served us well. They say your risk is because of what you don't know. So we try to find out everything we can to mitigate any risk that's involved and make the investment that much more secure and safe uh, for
Yep,
us as investors and those that you know we invest for. But this
absolutely.
is good. One of my favorite topics. Thank you for uh, sharing the top three. Um, and maybe we should go through a series of due diligence of all the steps that we go through to evaluate a note.
Yeah,
It's
I
it's a
think
it's a big
you know doing a topic or doing another session on due diligence and getting into some specific notes might be pretty helpful for the audience. So
Yeah, to be able to see what you
yeah,
see and
yeah,
what to look for,
yeah,
and the things that are glaring and things that are not so glaring, that you can really just begin to put in your tool belt, if you will, of investing in your skills and investing in mortgage notes.
absolutely. All
All
right,
right, Jerry. Thanks so much. I appreciate you as always.
all
Till
right.
next
Thank
time.
you.
And if
And
anybody would, oh, you
uh,
get ready to say,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
say it. I was getting ready to steal your thunder.
I did a lot of talking. Go ahead.
So if you um, like what you heard, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you have additional questions, feel free to comment in the YouTube or go to our website, firstshieldfinancial.com, and book a time to talk to either Kim or myself or one of our other team members about what's going on in the note world. We'll try to answer the questions that you have.
Yeah. And if you have some due diligence questions, right? We have
Absolutely.
an we have a community that you can be partake in to be able to get your due diligence questions answered. So lots of
Okay.
stuff going on there, and welcome the opportunity to share with you.
Okay.
All righty. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim.
All right. Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.